So at the risk of sounding like a 70-year-old church lady, I want to say to you today that I love potluck dinners. I do, I love them. I love the casseroles and the deviled eggs, and oh, the Jell-O salad. It's my favorite. I've been to a ton of them. We used to host them weekly at a house that I lived in for our friends and family. And then I even went to one last night that we started a few months ago with my group of friends here. There are times, though, then, that I see people start showing up. And I look over at the amount of food that we have. And then at the number of people that we have, and I get nervous that we are not going to have enough food. I start to panic and want to overfunction, run to the store and grab a salad or a rotisserie chicken or something, so that I know we won't go hungry. I believe in the power of the story of the loaves and fish where Jesus multiplied them for those gathered, but I don't like to test that very often. And so every time, though, somehow, miraculously, there's always enough. And oftentimes, there's even leftovers. It's hard for me to depend on other people. But God teaches me through potlucks that dependence on others is a good thing. Everyone brings their dish and contributes to the meal. A potluck is something that I cannot do on my own. We're in the middle of a 3-week series called Me Interrupted. And though probably not grammatically correct, we're talking about some of the things that we tell ourselves that are contrary to the things that God says to us. So just like I have to trust the potluck that the food will work out, God interrupts me to help me realize that I need to trust, even when I think I can do it on my own. I have to depend on those who come. God interrupts us when our thoughts are headed down the wrong road. The quote I used last week by Dietrich Bonhoeffer says this: "We must be ready to allow ourselves to be interrupted by God." The stinking thinking that we talked about last week rears its ugly head all too often in our lives. So the thought that we're exploring this week is I can do it on my own. This may not initially sound like a negative thought. In fact, it may be quite the opposite. It may sound like the thought of a confident person who believes in their ability to get all of their tasks done that they've been given. The ability to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, alone, without the help of others. But that's not the way that potlucks come together. And that's certainly not the way that the world works. Sometimes we have a sense of independence that's not always healthy for us. There are times when we neglect the need for each other. The beginning of the passage that Jordan just read talks about the community being of the same mind, being united. Paul here is talking to the church that he wants to draw together toward each other. And he wants us too to draw together toward each other. And I would even venture to say that it's talking about the community being dependent on each other. It says for them to think of others as better than themselves and to watch out what is best for others, not for themselves. In short, the scripture is saying to model our community after Jesus' attitude and behaviors. So this passage urges us to start thinking differently. We're encouraged to start thinking as a living, dynamic, interdependent, and interconnected community, living after the example of Christ. It takes humility to recognize our need for interdependence. When we draw together as a community, we're strengthened by one another. Thinking we can do it alone has the tendency to take us away from God. It takes us away from each other, and if we're not careful, it causes us to exploit people. Let me give you an example of what this looks like. I was talking this week with someone over lunch about potatoes. We were commenting on how delicious they were as we were enjoying them over lunch. And then we started thinking about the life cycle of a potato. How much energy time went into planting, tending, weeding, watering, harvesting, cleaning, shipping, buying, cooking, and eventually eating this potato. So much time and so many people went into generating this single potato. And this is often something that we don't even think about, unless maybe you're the ones to grow it yourself as a gardener. We often ignore those who put forth the effort to support these early stages, middle stages, and end stages of how we get our food. Sometimes even thinking subconsciously that those people are below us. We might think that we're better than they are because we get to work inside, in the air conditioning, growing our minds all day. Parker Palmer, one of my favorite theologians, once said, "Our lives are not for us alone. We are here to grow something that feeds others." Christ modeled this for us when he emptied himself of all status, becoming a slave, a servant. Christ would have been the one at the garden workday, working right alongside the other gardeners and getting his hands dirty. He showed us what humility truly looks like. That's what the heart of this passage is talking about, imitating Christ's humility. Shifting our mindset from I am better than them to they are better than me. And it takes courage to make this mental shift. I talked last week about how quickly our thoughts become our actions. So this passage is not only about shifting our mindset, but shifting our behavior. In thinking about this dual shift, it makes me wonder, how must we treat those whom we are dependent upon? How must we treat the farmers and gardeners who grow our food? How must we treat the grocery workers who work so hard to make sure that we have access to that food? If we were to think about it, this quickly becomes a justice issue. When we're shopping at the store, we sometimes gawk that apple prices have risen from $1.50 to $2.25 per pound. Or that organic produce costs so much more than non-organic. But trace these prices back to their supply chain that gets them to you. Think about how much of a fraction of a penny each person along the way gets. How much time and energy went into getting that apple to you. If we humanize the process and put actual faces to the process, to the steps along the way, we might not worry so much about that 75-cent increase. When we choose to buy these products, we're choosing to pay people a living wage. We're casting our vote for how to treat people. And that's just an example from produce. I can trace examples to nearly everything we buy. Toys, clothes, books, cars, houses. How are we treating those who we're connected to and dependent upon? Do we realize how our demand for lower prices keeps people in modern-day slavery? Seriously, the workers who assemble products, both here and abroad, can often spend more than 12 hours a day in horrendous working conditions and are paid embarrassingly low wages. Particularly bad is the trend of insourcing, as prison labor is often called, which is an even cheaper alternative to outsourcing. So instead of sending labor over to China or Bangladesh, manufacturers have chosen to forcibly employ the 2.4 million incarcerated people in the United States. Chances are high that if a product you're holding says American made, it was made in an American prison. On average, prison workers work 8 hours a day, but because they don't have any union representation, they make between 23 cents and $1.15 per hour. Over 6 times less than the federal minimum wage. And all of this so that large companies can buy their products at lower rates and shift their savings along to their customers so that people can save money and live better. But look at the cost. We're treating people like these disposable products that they assemble. I'll post a link later today on our Facebook page that was an article written earlier this week about this very issue, so you can study it a little bit more for yourself. But as I began thinking about this several years ago, instigated by assignment I had here as a junior, I became terribly troubled by workers' rights, and the injustices that I found were a part of so many of the products that I owned. It's frustrating to realize that your purchases can do so much harm to people. But as I began researching the effects of my buying power, I found that some companies are better than others. And I found resources that would help me figure out which companies I wanted to support over others. There's a website called Better World Shopper that rates companies based on a collection of factors, including workers' rights, the environment, and community involvement. They have a huge database with thousands of companies in it that have ratings so that you can know which ones you want to support and which ones you don't want to support. Now, all of this seems like a very big, complicated, interconnected system that we're a part of. There's so much interconnectedness between all of the different parts of it. So is there any hope that this can change? Anne Lamott once said, when God is going to do something wonderful, he starts with a hardship. When God is going to do something amazing, he starts with an impossibility. Changing the system that I'm talking about may feel like that impossibility, but I firmly believe that God has the power to change this terrible, unjust system. We may not have direct policies that we get to vote about that change prison workers' rights or the negative environmental impact of the oil and gas industry, for example. But we get to cast a vote every day. With every purchase that we make, we're casting a vote. This is a deeper meaning to the concept of purchasing power. Now, as I talk about this, you might be thinking how much work this takes. Yes, it most definitely does take a lot of work. But some of the things are worth the time and effort to make sure that we're imitating Christ's humility. We're treating people in a manner of Christ, considering them better than ourselves, helping them realize their value. All of this isn't only a social justice issue. When we get greedy with our money, it becomes a spiritual danger. Our faith life is not some separate thing that we come to chapel once a week to explore and participate in. It's something that I hope would guide us each and every day. In our thoughts we have and the actions we take. Our faith guides our decisions and ought to guide even the way that we spend our money. So it'd do us some good to think about what kind of faith our purchases are demonstrating. Is it a faith that responds to Paul's call to treat others as better than ourselves? Or is it a faith that primarily looks out for number one through a denial of our interconnectedness? When we ignore our interdependence, it's isolating and has consequences beyond what we may recognize. The injustices of working conditions and wage inequalities are just a few of the potential implications for thinking we're an island. In reality, God created us for community. God created us for each other. And God created us to need one another. We live in a world where interdependence is a good thing. Let us live into that reality more fully as a campus and as a church.